No one heard a shout. No branch snapped. No engine turned over to leave. Just a stretch of Ozark ground holding its breath, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like something was taken away and the space it left behind was sealed shut. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a gravel road ends without warning. No signs, no mailboxes, just tire ruts pressed into dirt that hasn't been disturbed in years. And on a night when sound should have carried, when even a cough would echo, nothing did. That's the part that still doesn't make sense. Before we go any further, take a second to check in. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments, because this story spans decades, and where you're standing as you hear it matters. This case doesn't begin with flashing lights or a crowd of onlookers. It begins with absence, with a job that was never finished, with a place that learned, early on, how to keep things from being noticed. The land sits outside eminence, Missouri, not close enough to feel watched, not far enough to feel untouched. Forest presses in from all sides. The kind of terrain where footsteps vanish quickly and directions stop being useful. You don't stumble into places like this by accident. You're either invited or you're sent. What makes this story different isn't how someone disappeared. It's how easily it happened twice. The first time, nearly 60 years earlier, the disappearance was dismissed before anyone bothered to ask the wrong questions. No family demanding answers. No urgency. Just a man who didn't come back, and a quiet agreement that this was normal enough not to chase. But the ground kept the memory. Wood decays, paper yellows, roads fall off maps, but pressure stays where it's applied, and certain places, once used a specific way, don't forget how. Much later, when another person vanished without leaving a sound behind, the truth surfaced slowly, not through confession, not through witnesses, but through an old note, a neglected structure, and a realization that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's engineered. If you're new here, consider subscribing now, because once this trail starts winding backward, every detail you think is small will matter more than you expect. This story doesn't ask what happened. It asks why no one heard it, and why that same quiet waited patiently to be used again. The paper trail begins in early spring, 1957, a season that never fully settles in the Ozarks. Winter loosens its grip slowly there. Frost still lingers in shaded hollows, while the ridges start to soften under pale green growth. Roads turn unreliable. Schedules bend to weather, daylight, and whoever is willing to work without asking too many questions. That's where he fit. He wasn't the kind of man people remembered for his stories or his opinions. He moved through the county the way seasonal labor always had, briefly, quietly, and without leaving much behind. He worked when there was work, slept where he was told he could, took cash when it was offered. When a job ended, he didn't linger long enough to be missed. In Shannon County, men like that were common enough not to stand out. The geography encouraged it. Long distances between properties, farms scattered miles apart, logging tracts carved out temporarily and abandoned just as fast, gravel roads that twisted without signs, sometimes splitting into paths that led nowhere at all. He stayed away from town whenever he could. When he did pass through, it was usually for supplies, feed stores, hardware counters, places where no one asked for more than a name and a nod. He didn't rent a room, didn't run a tab, didn't make promises that required follow-up. That anonymity wasn't suspicious in 1957, it was practical. Sheriff's notes from that year describe him without detail, as if even then he resisted definition. No known relatives nearby, no fixed address, no record of long-term employment, just a pattern of short jobs and longer gaps between them. He fixed fences, repaired sheds, patched roofs after storms rolled through the highlands, work that required hands, not paperwork. And when spring arrived, so did opportunity. Storm damage had left outbuildings leaning. Old structures needed attention before planting season began. Owners who lived closer to town hired men like him to handle the parts of their land they didn't want to reach themselves. That's how the shed entered the story. It sat on a parcel bordering state forest land, far enough from the nearest residence that no one kept an eye on it day to day. The road leading there wasn't marked on most county maps, even then. It existed because it had to, not because it was meant to last. According to the feed store clerk who saw him last, the job was described simply: fixing up a shed. reinforcing the floor, making it usable again. Nothing unusual in that. Outbuildings were often neglected until they became necessary, and necessity had a way of arriving without warning. The clerk remembered the timing more than the conversation. Just before dusk, that uncertain hour when daylight thins quickly in the hills and the forest begins to close ranks. He loaded supplies into the back of an aging pickup, boards, nails, hand tools, all purchased in cash. There was no sense of urgency, no hint that the job would be his last. What stands out now is how little direction he offered about where he was headed. Not evasive, just vague. A parcel near the forest, a stretch of land people didn't talk about because there was nothing to say. It wasn't dangerous, it wasn't valuable, it simply existed. And then he drove away. The road he took bent south, climbing slightly before disappearing into tree cover. Anyone watching from a distance would have lost sight of the truck within seconds. Sound would have followed longer, the engine echoing briefly off the ridges before fading into the low, steady hush that defines that part of Missouri. By the time darkness settled, no one was waiting for him anywhere. That detail mattered later. In 1957, it didn't. When he didn't return for his pay the following day, there was no immediate concern. Jobs like that didn't always end on schedule. Weather shifted plans. Owners traveled. Sometimes men took other work before circling back. Days passed, then a week, and only after that did the absence become noticeable, not because someone missed him, but because his truck appeared where it shouldn't have been. Still, in that moment, the past few days were already being explained away, quietly, efficiently, with the same assumptions that had closed so many similar gaps before. The land had time. So did whatever was waiting on it. Ordinary moments rarely announce themselves as final. They pass quietly, disguised as routine, a purchase made, a receipt folded once and slipped into a pocket, a door closing behind someone who expects to open it again later. In this case, the last ordinary moment unfolded beneath a low evening sky, just as the day began to give up its light. The feed store sat at the edge of town, where pavement turned to gravel and conversation thinned out. It smelled of grain, dust, and oil, the kind of place that stayed the same year after year because it had no reason to change. By the time he arrived, the rush had passed. Only one other customer lingered, leaning against the counter, waiting for change. He didn't browse. He knew what he needed. Lumber fasteners, nails sized for reinforcement, a few boards trimmed to fit into the bed of his pickup, hand tools he could carry in one trip. Nothing excessive. Nothing that suggested a job larger than he'd described. The clerk remembered his hands steady, practiced, moving through the items without hesitation. This wasn't a man guessing his way through a repair. He paid in cash, counted carefully, and asked for a receipt without explanation. It was already late enough that shadows stretched across the parking area, long and uneven where the gravel dipped. As the clerk rang him up, there was casual conversation, not friendly, not cold, the kind that fills space without trying to make a connection. When asked where he'd be working, he answered plainly, fixing up a shed, out near the forest. No landmarks offered, no road names, just a direction that made sense to him. He loaded the supplies himself, lifting boards into the truck bed and securing them with a short length of rope pulled from behind the seat. The pickup showed its age but ran clean. No visible leaks, tires worn, not bald. It was dependable enough for another trip into the hills. Before leaving, he leaned briefly against the door, scanning the horizon the way people do when they're measuring daylight instead of distance. Dusk comes quickly in the Ozarks. Once the sun slips behind the ridges, visibility changes fast. Familiar ground becomes uncertain, and unfamiliar ground becomes something else entirely. Still, he didn't rush. The clerk watched him pull away, the truck easing onto the road without urgency. Gravel shifted beneath the tires, then settled. The engine noise carried for a short distance, bouncing once against the tree line before thinning into the background hum of evening. That was it. No one followed. No one wrote down the license plate. No one thought to ask when he'd be back. Before we continue, pause for a moment. What's the weather like where you are right now? Clear? Overcast? Quiet? Drop it in the comments. Conditions matter more in this story than they first appear. When the store closed that night, the clerk locked the door and went home. Supper was eaten. Lights were turned off. Somewhere beyond the last visible bend in the road, the truck continued deeper into land that resisted being defined. The next day came and went without incident. By the second evening, questions surfaced, not concern, exactly, but curiosity. The job should have been finished by then, or at least far enough along to warrant a check-in. When no one heard from him, the assumption wasn't alarm, it was inconvenience. Work ran long. Plans shifted. It wasn't until the third day that the pickup was noticed sitting at an odd angle near a collapsed fence line, just far enough off the road that it didn't immediately draw attention. No supplies in the bed, no tools in the cab, the doors unlocked. What unsettled those who saw it wasn't damage or disorder. It was how intentional everything looked, as if the truck had been placed there, not abandoned, as if someone had taken time to make sure nothing obvious was left behind. Still, no one connected that sight to the feed store conversation. The ordinary moment had already faded, absorbed into dozens of others that passed without consequence. By the time anyone considered that evening again, the purchase, the rope, the way the daylight had thinned, it existed only as a memory filtered through time. Details softened, certainty slipped. What remained was a gap, a stretch of hours no one could account for, a destination no one could point to with confidence, and a job that, in hindsight, may never have been meant to be completed at all. The last ordinary moment had done its work. Everything after it belonged to something else. The pickup was finally noticed. It didn't look like a vehicle that had broken down. It looked like it had stopped on purpose. It sat half-hidden behind a sagging fence line on the south edge of an overgrown field. The nose pointed toward a stand of oak trees that swallowed the last few yards of visible trail. The ground beneath it was dry, no fresh ruts from spinning tires, no signs of panic braking or struggle. From a distance, it could have passed for any old farm truck parked where it didn't belong. Up close, the silence around it felt heavier. The first man to approach was a farmer checking fence posts that spring morning. He recognized the truck, but not the story behind it. The bed was empty, swept clean as though someone had taken a brush to it. The cab was the same seat wiped down, floorboards clear, no loose nails, no receipts, no trace of the supplies that should have been there. The glove box was closed. The key rested in the ignition. He called it in, mostly out of habit. Abandoned vehicles were common enough. People left them when the roads grew impassable or when engines quit halfway to town. The sheriff's office logged the location, sent a deputy out the next day. No urgency, just another task on a long list of spring errands. The deputy's report, written in neat cursive that later faded with time, described the scene plainly. Vehicle found intact, no sign of forced entry, no blood, no tracks leading away. That last note was the one that lingered. No tracks, none into the woods, none circling the truck, none that explained how a man could vanish from solid ground without leaving a footprint behind. The soil was soft enough to hold impressions, but whatever had happened there had left nothing readable. The deputy walked the perimeter twice, each time expanding the circle a little farther. He found the collapsed section of fencing that had once marked property boundaries but offered no clues. The grass beyond it had already begun to reclaim the area, the kind that rises overnight when rain and sunlight take turns. When he radioed back to the office, the report was routine. Truck abandoned. Possible voluntary disappearance. No indication of foul play. The file didn't grow much beyond that. At the time, disappearances like his rarely stirred headlines. There was no missing persons unit dedicated to men who traveled seasonally and lived alone. Without family to press the issue, the story ended as soon as the paper was filed. Weeks later, when someone finally asked what happened to the truck, it had already been towed into town and stored behind the county garage. The contents listed on the inventory sheet were short: one empty toolbox, one coil of rope, and an oil rag. The rope caught attention briefly, then didn't. Nothing about it suggested harm. It was a worker's tool, and men like him always carried one. The longer the truck sat there, the easier it became to stop asking questions. Old-timers in town reasoned that he had simply left, moved on to a different county, followed a job, maybe even joined relatives somewhere down south. The logic fit the times. People disappeared from rural routes all the time, not because of mystery but because of mobility. Life shifted quickly in places where records lagged behind. Still, something about the scene didn't add up. The cab's orderliness, the swept bed, the fact that dust had settled evenly over both the dashboard and the exterior, suggesting the truck hadn't been used since the day it was parked. When locals passed the site afterward, a few mentioned a feeling nothing they could explain, just an awareness that the spot didn't sound right. Birds still flew overhead, but their calls cut short. Even the wind seemed to lose momentum there, as if the air itself hesitated to move across the clearing. Back at the sheriff's office, the case cooled before it ever had the chance to warm up. The missing man had no dependents, no debt, no unfinished business anyone could trace. Without complaint or evidence, the file became one more among dozens, shelved under unresolved. If the truck had held answers, no one knew how to read them. Years later, when new deputies came across the old paperwork, they remarked on its simplicity. Just a few pages, mostly typed. A photo of the truck, a map reference scribbled in pencil, and one handwritten comment in the margin, faint now but still visible. Area inspected. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual. That phrase carried through every retelling that came after, as if repetition could make it true. But those who had stood there, who had felt the strange weight in the air, who had noticed the absence of echo when the breeze should have filled the space, remembered it differently. Ordinary or not, something had happened in that clearing, something the ground refused to show. By the time the paperwork reached the bottom of the stack, the disappearance had already been given a shape that made it easy to live with. Voluntary, temporary, unremarkable. Those labels did most of the work. They allowed the case to settle into a category that didn't demand follow-up, didn't require uncomfortable conversations, and didn't suggest that anything on the ground had gone wrong. In the late 1950 seconds, that mattered. Resources were thin, distances were long, and men who worked alone were expected to manage their own risks. Without family in the county, there was no one to ask hard questions. No one stood at the counter asking why the truck was found clean. No one insisted that the missing tools meant something more than forgetfulness. The absence was treated like a personal choice rather than a problem that belonged to anyone else. That choice made quietly, collectively closed the door. The sheriff's office did what it was designed to do under those assumptions. They logged the facts they had. They noted the lack of evidence. They moved on to matters that arrived with urgency attached. Theft, domestic disputes, accidents on the river, things that came with witnesses and noise. This case came with neither. As weeks turned into months, the language around it softened further. People stopped saying he disappeared. They said he left. They said he drifted. They said he found work somewhere else. Each version required less explanation than the last. The land where he'd been working followed the same pattern of neglect. Ownership shifted. Paperwork transferred hands. The parcel bordering the forest changed status twice in the following decade, each time becoming less central to anyone's plans. Farming pulled back from the harder ground. Clearings narrowed. Brush thickened. The road that once led to the shed became less a route and more a suggestion. What had been accessible grew inconvenient. What was inconvenient was ignored. There was no marker placed where the truck had been found. No note posted along the road. Within a few seasons, even locals had trouble pointing to the exact spot. Memory blurred the edges. Distance helped. Every so often, someone would mention the case in passing, usually when another truck broke down, usually as a comparison meant to reassure, at least this one can be fixed. Then the conversation would move on. Years later, when the county updated its maps, the old access road wasn't included. It no longer served a purpose. Roads that aren't used don't survive long in official records. The shed remained, though few remembered it. Its boards aged, its roof sagged, leaves collected in drifts around its base. It became part of the background, indistinguishable from the other structures left behind as agriculture shifted away from marginal land. If someone had stumbled across it, they would have seen nothing that demanded attention, and that was the point. Cases don't always go cold because answers are hard to find. Sometimes they cool because they fit too neatly into expectation. A missing man with no ties, a job that ends without ceremony, a place no one has reason to revisit. Before we move further, consider this. Do you think this disappearance would have been treated the same way today? Would it have drawn a search? A wider review? Let me know what you think in the comments. Decades passed with the file untouched. Paper faded, Ink thinned. The few photographs taken lost their clarity. New deputies came and went, each trained on current problems, not old gaps. The notes that did exist stayed buried under more recent concerns. And in those notes, a few details sat quietly, waiting for someone to read them without assumption. But assumption has momentum. By the time anyone thought to look back, the landscape itself had changed enough to support the original conclusion. The forest had closed in, the clearing had nearly vanished. The idea that something could be hidden there felt less plausible than the idea that nothing had happened at all. That's how places learn what they can get away with. Silence, when it works once, becomes a method, and long before anyone realized it, the ground had already proven it could keep one person from being noticed. The only thing left to test was whether time had made it easier or harder to do it again. The inspection happened weeks after the truck was found, long after urgency had thinned into routine. By then, the job was no longer about finding a man. It was about closing a loop, making sure nothing had been missed badly enough to reopen questions no one wanted to answer. The deputy arrived alone. The parcel sat where private land blurred into state forest, the boundary marked more by habit than fencing. What remained of the road was narrow and uneven, a stretch of ground pressed flat by years of occasional use rather than maintenance. Grass grew up the center. Low branches leaned in, forcing the vehicle to slow to a crawl. The shed was still standing. It didn't stand out in size or shape, rectangular, low roof, weathered boards grayed by exposure. It looked like dozens of other outbuildings scattered across the county, structures built for function, not longevity, the kind people forgot about until they needed them again. From the outside, there was no obvious reason to stop. The door hung slightly off-square, swollen by moisture. One hinge had been reinforced at some point, newer metal bolted against older wood. The lock was missing, replaced by a loop of wire twisted tight. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested urgency. The deputy circled it once, boots brushing through leaf litter that had collected unevenly along the walls. He checked the roofline, the corners, the ground nearby. No sign that anyone had camped there, no tools left behind, no disturbance that pointed to a struggle. Then he stepped inside. The interior was dim even at midday. Light filtered through gaps in the boards, thin lines cutting across the floor. The space was mostly empty, no stored equipment, no stacked feed bags. Just a low platform set slightly off-center, built solidly into the structure. That was when he noticed the weight. It wasn't visual. It was felt. The floor didn't flex the way it should have. When he shifted his stance, the boards beneath his boots held firm, dense, in a way that didn't match the rest of the shed. Storage buildings in that area were usually raised just enough to keep them dry. This one felt anchored. He crouched and rapped his flashlight against the boards. The sound didn't echo. It didn't travel. It didn't bounce back the way hollow spaces usually answered. Instead, it seemed to disappear immediately, absorbed before it could finish forming. The second knock did the same thing. So did the third. The deputy paused. He wrote later that it was probably rot, or thick reinforcement, or poor acoustics caused by the low ceiling and surrounding forest. All reasonable explanations, all easier than the alternative. He didn't pry up the boards. There was no warrant, no probable cause, no expectation that a shed plain, aging, unremarkable, held anything more than mice and dust. The case file didn't demand it. The assumptions made earlier still held. He noted the observation anyway. Briefly, one line among many. Outbuilding inspected. Floor unusually solid. No further issues observed. Then he closed the door and stepped back into daylight. That moment, small as it seemed, carried more weight than anyone realized. After that visit, the shed faded even further into the background. Seasons did their work. Rain warped the boards. Insects hollowed out what was soft. Brush crept closer, eventually pressing against the walls. From a distance, it blended into the tree line. Its edges softened until it looked like part of the forest, rather than something placed there. The road leading to it became harder to follow. Fallen limbs blocked sections. Washouts redirected the path. Eventually, it stopped being passable by vehicle at all, and with that, the shed stopped being visited. Decades later, when land records were reviewed for unrelated reasons, the outbuilding was still listed, though no one could say when it had last been used. Aerial photographs showed a faint rectangle barely visible beneath encroaching canopy. It was there, but not present in any meaningful way. By the time Kane Thompson purchased nearby land years afterward, the shed wasn't something people mentioned. There was no warning attached to the property, no stories passed along with the paperwork. The old note in the sheriff's file remained buried, unread by anyone who didn't already know what to look for. But places don't require attention to remain active. Pressure doesn't dissipate just because it's ignored. It settles. It waits. It becomes part of the structure. What that deputy felt under his boots, the unnatural firmness, the absence of sound, wasn't evidence yet. It was potential. A detail that meant nothing until the moment it meant everything. And that moment wouldn't come until the ground was tested again. Because once silence proves effective, it doesn't need to be redesigned. It only needs opportunity. Time didn't rush to erase what people left behind. It worked patiently, layer by layer, doing what no decision ever formally approved. Ownership of the land shifted the way it often did in rural Missouri, quietly, through paperwork signed miles away from the property itself. One owner sold to another. Parcels were divided, recombined, then neglected again. Each transaction pulled attention farther from the edges and closer to what could be easily reached. Fields nearest paved roads stayed in use. Everything else drifted. The clearing shrank first. Grass gave way to brush to saplings. Within a few years, the open ground around the shed had narrowed enough that sunlight no longer reached it evenly. Shade lingered longer each day. Moisture settled into the soil and stayed there. What had once been a working space became transitional, neither field nor forest, just a place passing from one state to another. The road followed the same pattern. Gravel washed away after heavy rains. Ruts deepened, then softened, then filled. County crews stopped grading it once it no longer served anyone's routine. Eventually, the road stopped being recognized as one. Tires avoided it. Maps dropped it. The land reclaimed the path without resistance. Structures left without purpose don't announce their decline. They simply become less noticeable. Boards gray, nails loosen. Rooflines sag enough to change how water runs, but not enough to collapse. The shed remained upright long after it stopped being useful, as if persistence alone could keep it relevant. No one went inside anymore. When people did pass nearby, hunters cutting through during season, land surveyors checking boundary markers, they didn't linger. The place offered no reason to. Nothing was broken enough to require fixing. Nothing was valuable enough to protect. And nothing seemed wrong. That was the trick of it. The longer the land went without attention, the more normal its silence felt. Forests are expected to be quiet in certain ways. The absence blended in, indistinguishable from natural stillness. The case file followed a similar arc. As years passed, the paper thinned and yellowed. The handwriting grew harder to read. Clerks reorganized storage rooms. Boxes were moved, stacked, labeled with broader categories. Eventually, the file found its way into a section marked inactive, where problems go when they no longer interrupt the present. New deputies came through the office with no memory of the truck, the fence line, or the shed. Training focused on current concerns, patrol routes, updated procedures, new equipment. Old gaps weren't revisited unless something forced the issue. Nothing did. The land taught the same lesson the paperwork did. Without pressure, things stay buried. Seasons repeated themselves. Winters hardened the ground. Springs softened it again. Trees grew taller, then thicker, then closer together. Roots pushed deeper, disturbing soil in slow, imperceptible ways that left no clear beginning or end. If something had been placed beneath that shed, if weight had been distributed carefully, if space had been shaped with intention, time didn't undo it. It reinforced it. Compacted soil holds memory well. Layers compress, voids disappear. Decades later, aerial photographs would show the area as an uninterrupted stretch of green. No clearing, no road, just canopy. Anyone looking at those images without context would see nothing worth questioning. That's what time does best. It removes contrast. By the time Kane Thompson purchased nearby land, the shed existed more as an entry on a land description than as a physical place anyone could point to. It wasn't mentioned during negotiations. It wasn't walked during inspections. The focus stayed on acreage, access, and timber value. The past didn't come up because it didn't need to. But time, for all its efficiency, doesn't erase function. It only disguises it. Structures built for a purpose retain that purpose long after the reason for it fades. Ground prepared a certain way remains prepared, even when covered. Silence trained once doesn't forget how to behave. The land had been tested and had passed. What no one considered, what time itself couldn't answer, was whether that test had been the end of the story or merely the first trial run. Because while people moved on and records thinned and roads disappeared, the conditions that allowed one person to vanish remained intact. Wait-in. When Kane Thompson signed the paperwork, nothing about the land suggested a history worth mentioning. The listing emphasized acreage and timber potential. Access routes were marked loosely, with the understanding that some would need clearing. The price reflected the effort required to bring portions of it back into use. There were no disclosures beyond what was legally necessary, no footnotes, no warnings passed quietly from seller to buyer. For Kane, that was part of the appeal. He wasn't looking for a place shaped by other people's expectations. He wanted space ground that hadn't been overmanaged or smoothed into predictability. Land that could still be read, if you knew how to look. He walked the boundaries himself, noting elevation changes, drainage patterns, and the way the forest shifted as it approached the state land. What he didn't see was just as important. There were no visible remnants of past activity, no obvious foundations, no cleared areas that suggested long-term use. The forest had done its work thoroughly. From most angles, the property looked like an unbroken stretch of hardwood and undergrowth. The shed sat just beyond what Kane considered his main tract, close enough to matter, but far enough to avoid immediate attention. It wasn't visible from the access point. To reach it required following a faint depression in the ground that only became noticeable when light hit it at the right angle. When he came across it for the first time, it felt less like a discovery and more like an interruption. The structure was smaller than he expected, lower to the ground, weathered to the point where its outline blended into the surrounding trees. If he hadn't been walking slowly, he might have passed it without realizing what it was. He circled it once, testing the door, peering through gaps in the boards. It was empty, or appeared to be. No stored equipment, no recent use, just dust, leaves, and the smell of damp wood. The floor caught his attention, not because it looked different, but because it felt different underfoot. The boards didn't respond the way old structures usually do. There was no give, no hollow thump. The weight of the building seemed pressed downward rather than resting. Kane didn't know why that detail stayed with him. He didn't mention it to anyone. At the time, it registered as an oddity, nothing more. He had other concerns: clearing trails, marking boundaries, planning how the land would be used over time. The shed wasn't part of those plans. It wasn't in the way, and it wasn't useful. So he left it alone. Over the next few years, Kane spent time on the property intermittently. Weekends, hunting season, occasional workdays. He learned the rhythms of the place, the way fog settled in low areas, the spots where sound traveled farther than expected, the sections of forest that seemed to absorb noise completely. Those quiet pockets stood out. There were places where even deliberate movement felt muted, where footsteps didn't carry and voices fell flat. He chalked it up to terrain and vegetation. Dense growth changes acoustics. That's common knowledge among people who spend time outdoors. Still, he found himself avoiding certain routes without consciously deciding to. Trails bent away from areas that felt closed off. He didn't question it. The land offered plenty of alternatives. Years passed that way. It wasn't until another person entered the picture, someone whose presence disrupted the established routine, that the shed returned to Kane's awareness. This time, not as a forgotten structure, but as a reference point, a location, a place that could be described if needed. The day that person didn't return, Kane retraced steps the way anyone would. He checked the obvious spots first: access points, known paths, areas near water. The shed came up late in the process, almost as an afterthought. By then, it had been years since anyone had stood inside it. What Kane didn't know, what no one had reason to tell him, was that the ground beneath that structure had already been documented once before. Briefly, in a line written decades earlier by someone who noticed something was off but didn't know what to do with the feeling. History rarely announces itself when it repeats. It waits for conditions to align. New ownership, familiar silence, a place already proven capable of keeping things contained. Kane Thompson had unknowingly stepped into a pattern that had been dormant, not dormant because it failed, but because it hadn't been needed. And now, the land was being tested again. Silence had been misunderstood from the beginning. It wasn't emptiness, it wasn't chance, and it wasn't the absence of activity. What the shed revealed forced everyone involved to confront a harder truth, that quiet, when shaped carefully, can function as a tool. From the outside, the land had done nothing remarkable. It didn't draw attention. It didn't repel it either. It existed in a way that allowed people to project their assumptions onto it. Remote meant harmless. Old meant irrelevant. Stillness meant nothing was happening. Those assumptions carried weight. They shaped how the first disappearance was handled. They justified closing a file early. They allowed a deputy's unease to be written off as instinct without evidence. Silence worked because it matched expectation. But silence also requires maintenance. The structure beneath the shed wasn't simply hidden, it was integrated. It relied on the natural properties of the terrain, soil density, moisture retention, sound dampening created by surrounding growth. Nothing about it fought the environment. It blended into it, allowing nature to do most of the work. That blending made the second disappearance possible. By the time attention returned to the land, the silence had already proven reliable. It had contained one absence without consequence. Repeating the process didn't feel like risk. It felt like reuse. Investigators began to understand that what they were dealing with wasn't just a location tied to events, but a method anchored in place. The ground itself had been selected because it cooperated. This reframing changed how the past was read. The abandoned truck was no longer an oddity. It was part of the process. The clean cab wasn't courtesy, it was control. The lack of tracks wasn't luck. It was design reinforced by terrain and time. Even the deputy's flashlight knocked decades earlier took on new meaning. The sound hadn't vanished because of rot or acoustics. It had been absorbed intentionally, engineered into the structure from the start. Silence, in this case, wasn't passive. It was active restraint. What unsettled investigators most was how easily the pattern had gone unnoticed. Not because people were careless, but because nothing demanded urgency until repetition forced it. One disappearance could be explained away. Two could not. That's how silence finally broke, not through noise, but through comparison. The land hadn't changed. The people had. Modern procedures demanded review. Old files were digitized. Overlapping locations flagged. What once required intuition now required documentation. The same detail that failed to stop the first disappearance became impossible to ignore the second time. Kane struggled with that realization. He hadn't ignored warning signs because he lacked concern. He ignored them because they didn't register as warnings at all. The shed wasn't threatening. The quiet wasn't alarming. The land had taught him how to move around it comfortably, and he had followed those lessons without question. That discomfort stayed with him long after the site was secured. Silence had shaped his behavior as effectively as it had shaped the outcome, and that, ultimately, was the most unsettling part of the story, not what was hidden, but how willingly people adapted to its presence without knowing why. Silence didn't force compliance. It invited it. Even after the site was secured and the evidence catalogued, the case refused to settle neatly. There were questions no excavation could resolve, gaps no report could fully close. The structure beneath the shed explained how silence had been used, but not when the idea first formed, or how many times it had been tested before anyone noticed. Official records focused on what could be proven. Timelines were reconstructed. Conclusions were revised. The first disappearance was no longer framed as a choice. It was acknowledged for what it had always been, an absence that had been made possible by preparation and neglect working together. But beyond that, the story loosened its grip on certainty. No one could say exactly when the ground was altered. No one could confirm whether the method had been shared, taught, or arrived at independently. And no one could explain why the place itself never drew attention sooner, even as everything around it changed. The land remained. After investigators left, it returned to the same state it had occupied for decades, quiet, contained, unremarkable. The shed, now dismantled, existed only in photographs and measurements. The forest resumed its slow advance, filling in the space with the same patience that had concealed the truth in the first place. Kane moved away not long after. He didn't speak publicly about the case. Those who knew him noticed changes, routes he avoided, silences he didn't fill. He carried the awareness that some places teach you how to behave without asking permission, and once you learn those lessons, you don't easily forget them. What remains unresolved isn't the sequence of events, it's the ease with which one disappearance was dismissed, the ease with which the second nearly followed the same path, the ease with which silence, once accepted, became a feature rather than a flaw. If there's something this case leaves behind, it isn't fear, it's unease. Because nothing about the land was extraordinary. It wasn't hidden far beyond reach. It wasn't protected by distance alone. It existed close enough to be ignored and quiet enough to blend in. That's what makes the unanswered questions linger. How many places like this exist, locations shaped just enough to disappear things without consequence? How often do assumptions do the work of concealment long before anyone realizes it? And how many stories end early, not because answers are impossible to find, but because silence is allowed to stand in for them? Before we close, take a moment. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Let me know in the comments. If this story made you reconsider how absence can be engineered, make sure to like and share it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the next trail we follow also begins with something that didn't make a sound. Some places don't need to hide. They only need time. Silence had been misunderstood from the beginning. It wasn't emptiness, it wasn't chance, and it wasn't the absence of activity. What the shed revealed forced everyone involved to confront a harder truth, that quiet, when shaped carefully, can function as a tool. From the outside, the land had done nothing remarkable. It didn't draw attention. It didn't repel it either. It existed in a way that allowed people to project their assumptions onto it. Remote meant harmless. Old meant irrelevant. Stillness meant nothing was happening. Those assumptions carried weight. They shaped how the first disappearance was handled. They justified closing a file early. They allowed a deputy's unease to be written off as instinct without evidence. Silence worked because it matched expectation. But silence also requires maintenance. The structure beneath the shed wasn't simply hidden, it was integrated. It relied on the natural properties of the terrain, soil density, moisture retention, sound dampening created by surrounding growth. Nothing about it fought the environment. It blended into it, allowing nature to do most of the work. That blending made the second disappearance possible. By the time attention returned to the land, the silence had already proven reliable. It had contained one absence without consequence. Repeating the process didn't feel like risk. It felt like reuse. Investigators began to understand that what they were dealing with wasn't just a location tied to events, but a method anchored in place. The ground itself had been selected because it cooperated. This reframing changed how the past was read. The abandoned truck was no longer an oddity. It was part of the process. The clean cab wasn't courtesy, it was control. The lack of tracks wasn't luck. It was design reinforced by terrain and time. Even the deputy's flashlight knocked decades earlier took on new meaning. The sound hadn't vanished because of rot or acoustics. It had been absorbed intentionally, engineered into the structure from the start. Silence, in this case, wasn't passive. It was active restraint. What unsettled investigators most was how easily the pattern had gone unnoticed. Not because people were careless, but because nothing demanded urgency until repetition forced it. One disappearance could be explained away. Two could not. That's how silence finally broke, not through noise, but through comparison. The land hadn't changed. The people had. Modern procedures demanded review. Old files were digitized. Overlapping locations flagged. What once required intuition now required documentation. The same detail that failed to stop the first disappearance became impossible to ignore the second time. Kane struggled with that realization. He hadn't ignored warning signs because he lacked concern. He ignored them because they didn't register as warnings at all. The shed wasn't threatening. The quiet wasn't alarming. The land had taught him how to move around it comfortably, and he had followed those lessons without question. That discomfort stayed with him long after the site was secured. Silence had shaped his behavior as effectively as it had shaped the outcome, and that, ultimately, was the most unsettling part of the story, not what was hidden, but how willingly people adapted to its presence without knowing why. Silence didn't force compliance. It invited it. Even after the site was secured and the evidence catalogued, the case refused to settle neatly. There were questions no excavation could resolve, gaps no report could fully close. The structure beneath the shed explained how silence had been used, but not when the idea first formed, or how many times it had been tested before anyone noticed. Official records focused on what could be proven. Timelines were reconstructed. Conclusions were revised. The first disappearance was no longer framed as a choice. It was acknowledged for what it had always been, an absence that had been made possible by preparation and neglect working together. But beyond that, the story loosened its grip on certainty. No one could say exactly when the ground was altered. No one could confirm whether the method had been shared, taught, or arrived at independently. And no one could explain why the place itself never drew attention sooner, even as everything around it changed. The land remained. After investigators left, it returned to the same state it had occupied for decades, quiet, contained, unremarkable. The shed, now dismantled, existed only in photographs and measurements. The forest resumed its slow advance, filling in the space with the same patience that had concealed the truth in the first place. Kane moved away not long after. He didn't speak publicly about the case. Those who knew him noticed changes, routes he avoided, silences he didn't fill. He carried the awareness that some places teach you how to behave without asking permission, and once you learn those lessons, you don't easily forget them. What remains unresolved isn't the sequence of events, it's the ease with which one disappearance was dismissed, the ease with which the second nearly followed the same path, the ease with which silence, once accepted, became a feature rather than a flaw. If there's something this case leaves behind, it isn't fear, it's unease. Because nothing about the land was extraordinary. It wasn't hidden far beyond reach. It wasn't protected by distance alone. It existed close enough to be ignored and quiet enough to blend in. That's what makes the unanswered questions linger. How many places like this exist, locations shaped just enough to disappear things without consequence? How often do assumptions do the work of concealment long before anyone realizes it? And how many stories end early? Not because answers are impossible to find, but because silence is allowed to stand in for them. Before we close, take a moment. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Let me know in the comments. If this story made you reconsider how absence can be engineered, make sure to like and share it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the next trail we follow also begins with something that didn't make a sound. Some places don't need to hide. They only need time.